All right, welcome to the second hour. It's a little bit late this time because I thought, of course, there was going to be the debate with Matt Dillahunty, so I've spent many, many days preparing for that. Not so much because I'm afraid that he's going to present some case that I haven't heard. Most of the time, atheists are just going to repeat old 17th century arguments anyway. But anytime there's a serious debate, I take a lot of time and prep in getting ready for it and listening to a lot of the debates that Matt did. For example, I watched the entire debate with Jordan Peterson. And Jordan Peterson, I'll give him some credit. In the middle of the debate, he was very weak in the beginning. In the middle of the debate, he started asking questions about presuppositions. And so he actually gave Matt a pretty good presuppositional challenge, and I would say pretty much stumped him there towards the middle about value judgments and presupposing metaphysical and ethical truths in order to live in this world. But anyway, as I said, the last discussion that we did was on St. Gregory Palamos, and trying to really elucidate this for the people who are not familiar with his work. I mean, he's really not that well known in the West, even though he's one of the most important saints in the Orthodox Church. So we want to be very familiar with this theology and understand why it's so important. Now, in the first talk, we went through the totality of the book, the debate with a Barlaamite. But what we want to do in the second half is I want to show that in many places, of course, St. Gregory cites St. Maximus. Now, I did a couple talks, or I did a talk a couple years ago where I touched on the Logoi doctrine of St. Maximus. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do two different things. We're going to talk about the way St. Maximus uses Aristotle, because what we find is that he actually uses Aristotle in a very similar way to St. John of Damascus, right? About a century later, St. John is looking back. We went through the entirety, of course, of St. John of Damascus's work. And he, of course, looks back to the Sixth Council where Maximus was sort of battling the monothelites, and we got the doctrine of two wills and two energies in Christ, right? But what tends to happen in a lot of these discussions is the mistaken usage of Aristotle, right? So when we come to the time of Aquinas and the philosophers in the West, they use Aristotle in a different way. Now, the key text that everybody should be familiar with just on that topic, if you're interested in it, is David Bradshaw's book, Aristotle, East and West. And what that does is really analyze Aristotle in terms of his argumentation and his own metaphysic, you could say, and the way it's viewed differently overall in the East and the West. But what's very fascinating is that, for example, when we did the metaphysics talk, Hidden Metaphysics, 3 years ago, from this book, we covered Fount of Knowledge, right, which is John Damascus's philosophical book, which is about the first 100 pages or so of this book, right? Because this is actually like 3 books in one here. So you get Fount of Knowledge, and then you get the list of the heresiology of all the history of heresies, and then you get the main work, Defense of the Orthodox Faith, on the Orthodox Faith. And we know that the usage of Aristotle there is different than in the West, but we want to kind of get an idea for how Aristotle has been properly appropriated in the East in a different way than the West. So we don't, for example, deny being scholastic, being academic. We don't deny the usefulness of the intellect, of logic, or of education. St. Basil, for example, was classically educated. St. Gregory Palamos was trained in Aristotelian logic. And he never denied those things. But when we read the triads, we have at the very beginning, within the first 3 pages, statements about how Platonism, Hellenism are demonic doctrines. And essentially what he's talking about is the fact that they lead us away from Christology. And the reason that our saints have said this is because of many centuries of dealing with dialectical philosophy from Hellenic thinkers, whether it's Celsus, whether it's Plotinus, whether it's the dialectics of any of the heretical groups, the Arians, the Eunomians, Macedonians. We have dealt for many, many centuries with the attempt to import either-ors, dialectics, et cetera, into the theology and to subvert the theology. That's very key to see. So one of the first things we know is that we want, when we talk about, this is the term, like, for example, Jerusalem versus Athens, right? With Jerusalem representing revelation from God, Athens representing the philosophy of man and humanism in the Greeks. So there is a proper use of Aristotle. There's a proper use of maybe even Plato to a degree. We don't deny that the philosophers had insights, but we don't want to equate, for example, the meanings of terms, right? For example, in our theology, the word hypostasis, person, has a very specific and precise usage. Now, it's true that there's a little bit of debate in the early church over that term, but eventually it comes to have a normative meaning after the councils. So we couldn't, for example, give a new meaning to the term hypostasis within Orthodoxy. It's already kind of settled. Of course, as you know, hypostasis answers the question of who is doing a thing. Energy answers the question of what is being done, right? An action. Nature answers the question of what kind of thing is doing that thing, right? Whether it's a human nature or divine nature. So those are kind of the basic little terminological things that we want to be familiar with, right? Like energy, person, and nature, right? And so those distinctions are very important to us in our theology. Now, one of the works that we want to start with, just to make this a little kind of simple, is the 200 chapters on theology from St. Maximos. Now, don't worry about, if you don't have this work, it's not that big of a deal. I'm really just going to be going through some of the first few pages to show the way that he uses Aristotle, right? And now, if you haven't heard the Aristotle talks, I got to remember to leave a link below to the talks that we did on Aristotle a couple years ago. My nose keeps itching. I apologize. Allergies. So, and then we'll see the continuity between St. John Damascus and Fountain of Knowledge and what we see here in St. Maximus, because, again, John Damascus would have read Maximus. He would have known this. He cites him in Book 3 of Defense of the Orthodox Faith. So he begins by saying here, God is one, and he's without first principle. He's incomprehensible throughout being the total potentiality of being, and he excludes all the absolute categories or all the concepts of temporal or qualified existence. He is not subject to any, and is not discernible to any being on the basis of natural reflection. Now, it's true that St. Maximus is starting here with the idea of God as one, right? We have no problem with that. Let's see. He says he's without first principle, so he doesn't have any principles that brought him to be, right? He is throughout being the total potentiality of being. So notice already, he's not pure act per se. He's not just one thing. He is, according to St. Maximus, the total potentiality of being. So we are using Aristotelian terms of potentia and act, right? But he says he excludes absolutely the concept of temporal or qualified existence, since he is inaccessible to natural reflection. Now, this is really important because, and this is from Ambiguum 10, where he also said he also says this in Ambiguum 10, right? So we have to be really careful here, because what tends to happen in Roman Catholic theology, for example, or Thomistic theology, or a lot of Western theology is reading back into guys from the 6th, 7th century, ideas that would later develop in the West. So he is one, right? He's the total potentiality of being. But what are we speaking of here? Are we using the Western approach of talking about an abstract category of being and essence? Or in fact, is this a denial of that? God is one. He's the total potentiality of being. He is inaccessible to natural reflection. This is a denial of natural theology in the Western sense. And as we progress, as we understand the doctrine of the Logoi, the many Logoi, which are uncreated energies, the archetypes and patterns of created things that are all one in the Logos, we'll understand that it's absolutely impossible to reconcile this to Thomistic natural theology. That's why within the first chapter of Orthodox Dogmatics by Father Staniloy, this is exactly what he says. He says that the Orthodox can't hold to the Thomistic version of natural theology because we believe in the phraseology, the approach of St. Maximus. So he specifically contrasts the two theologies. Now note that the statement, he is inaccessible to natural reflection, right, from Ambiguum 10, is a further confirmation, not just of apophatic theology, which is theology through negation, or via negativa in the West, but that you can't reflect on the basis of nature and reason up to the existence of a perfect being or a generic being or a generic cause. That's why we actually see that St. Maximus, like the rest of our tradition, is beginning with the personhood here. He is inaccessible to natural reflection. We don't begin with generic concepts of unity, of first causes. Now, he is talking about a first cause here, and it's fine to talk about God as the first cause. But our first cause is not a chain of arguments borrowed from Aristotle. Our first cause is he, right? We're not out to prove the existence of a super simple essence, a super simple substance, generic being at the top of a chain of being. We're not out to prove that. We're out to prove Exodus 3:14. Right? And how does Exodus 3:14 start? How does it speak when it talks about God's existence? God says, I am that I am. Right? In other words, the beginning of this phrase, I am, is personal. Now, you can derive from this, as many church fathers do, that this has implications for being. You could say, yes, this does mean that God is perfect existence. God is the ultimate being. God is the purest expression of whatever predicates and divine names you want to use. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, if we read Dionysius, we also have a talk on the divine names by Dionysius. We can go listen to that talk, part 1 and part 2 as well, here in the subscribers section for members. You'll know that we covered this issue there as well, that the problem is not in predicating terms like being or existence or goodness to God. The problem is that the doctrine of simplicity that the West has from the time of the Middle Ages, early Middle Ages, all the way up through to Vatican I, is a very strict doctrine, where all the names and predicates of God are strictly identical to the divine essence. That's the normative, dogmatic Roman Catholic view, setting aside the minutiae of a couple schools within Roman Catholicism that have a differing view. That's still not the Orthodox view, right? The Duns Scotus and people like this, Franciscans. Their view is not uncreated grace. Their view is not that we are deified by divine energies that are distinct from divine essence. Right? Point being is that what we have is Maximus utilizing these philosophic categories in much the same way as John in John 1 would utilize logos. Right? If we think about logos, let's show that we're not having a univocal linguistic equivalence. Right? In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. What's the context for John using this? Is it a Greek term? Absolutely. Is it a term from Greek culture? Sure. Where did it come from? It came from Greek translations of the Old Testament, right? Septuagint, this kind of stuff. Philo had been using this idea that there is amongst creation a pattern of law and order and reason that governs creation. Right? Creation is an orderly universe, summed up under this this term universe, summed up under this idea of some unifying principle. And amazingly, right, whether those Stoic philosophers who talked about logos had read the Old Testament or not, they conceived of it as logos, right? Logic, a principle that undergirds and overrides and kind of withholds, keeps in being, and gives order and meaning to the created world, hence logos. Now, for many of these Greek philosophers, for the Stoics, for people like Marcus Aurelius, the idea is that logos is equivalent to an abstract, impersonal force, right? Something like a number or just this kind of governing principle of law, like a Newtonian law, perhaps. I mean, they didn't believe in Newtonian laws, but the Greeks did kind of pioneer this conception of abstract, impersonal laws and forces governing creation, governing the world, we'll say, right? So for the Greeks, we could say that logos has the equivalent of abstract force. Think of it like a number. Think of it like the laws of logic, syllogistic logic from Aristotle, or think of it like a law of gravity, right? When we read somebody like Marcus Aurelius, that's the concept that we get. And so for Marcus Aurelius, and I have a talk on Marcus Aurelius, you can go listen to that. We know from when we did that work that he kind of says, well, that's why we have a Roman emperor, right? The Roman emperor is kind of the focal point, the instantiation, you almost could say perhaps the incarnation of the Logos principle, right? And hence he kind of is the guiding force of the imperium to bring the law and the order to the whole oikumene, the whole universal imperium. And that's quite literally why Stoicism was so useful to the Roman emperors and their philosophy. Many, not all of them, but many of them were Stoics. And Stoicism had a lot of popularity amongst the upper class in Rome. So the key thing that we want to point out here is that there's many, many years of debate over this question, and there's a debate that came up. There's an issue that came up between St. Basil talking about the one, right, God, and the way that it was used in Plotinus. Now, Plotinus, of course, is the Neoplatonic, we'll say, for sake of simplicity, philosopher, regurgitating Plato, and kind of countering the Christians. And this had an appeal to some people because there's a lot of similar terminology. Right? The Neoplatonists would use the term triad, dyad. They would use the term logos, right? Hypostasis. They would use a lot of these same terms, but they had different meanings, and that's what's key to see here. And the meaning is what's key. So a lot of the debate between the East and the West, between Rome and the Orthodox Church, between the philosophers and the Orthodox, is confusion over language, confusion over the issue of, say, the word concept fallacy, right? Assuming that a word has the same meaning in all contexts. But that's not true. Take, for example, reason. Do you think reason means the same thing to David Hume as, say, to Kurt Gödel, right? A very rational mathematician. Or between Hume and a Platonist, right? They have very different conceptions of what reason is. So we can't necessarily just assume that there's a univocal, single definition of what reason is, and then in all the history of Western philosophy or even Eastern philosophy or global philosophy, whatever, discourse, that it always means the same thing. In the same way, and this will be one of the chief areas where we want to critique somebody like E. Michael Jones, we want to point out that logos is not a synthesis of Greek philosophy and Hebrew tradition. Now, there is a sense in which when the Old Testament is translated into Greek, it is preparatory for the message going out to the rest of the world. There is a sense in which, apologetically speaking, yes, John can in John 1 use the term logos to try to appeal to the Greek audience. And if I were to debate any philosophers, I would or pagans, I would do that same thing. But when I'm doing that, I'm not doing that because they have the same idea in mind as I do. I'm doing that because I want to point out that you don't have the same idea in mind as I do, but you need it to be the same idea that I have, particularly when it comes to the question of logos. Right? So for us, logos is not an abstract force that permeates the universe. If we're appealing to the Greek philosopher, and we want to use that as an apologetic place to begin our conversation, I would say, yeah, the logos is a common ground for us, except that the logos that you have makes no sense. It makes no sense to say an impersonal, abstract force permeates and guides the universe. In order for something to be guided, it presupposes personhood, a personal God, not an abstract, impersonal Greek force. And the Greeks had a big problem with this. They couldn't conceive of God being personal, that you could have a relationship with. This is why, for example, Aristotle conceives of God as thought thinking itself, an abstracted thought that's just kind of in a circular self-thinking spiral. And in Aristotle's mind has no real relationship or interpenetration or action in this world. It's more of a deistic kind of watchmaker conception of God. But so what we want to point out here, and this is key, is that when we see Exodus 3:14 and I am, and when we see logos, right, which the Greeks thought of as abstracted force, right, many times, not always, but most of the time in Roman Catholic theology, for example, I am in Exodus 3:14 is conceived of as self-existent being, pure being. And logos is conceived of amongst pagans and Greeks, Greek Hellenic philosophers, Stoics, as an abstracted force. Now, what we want to say is that neither of these things is true. Logos is not, as the Greeks thought, a abstract force. And Exodus 3:14 is not primarily saying that God is the equivalent of being. God is not saying I am equated to a common category of existence, namely being, right, as if he were at the top of a chain of being. And that's how the Roman Catholic system has traditionally conceived of that text. You could read it, for example, Etienne Gilson in his, I think it's called Medieval Philosophy. He has or Medieval Theology. I forget, it's been many years since I read it, but he actually exegetes Exodus 3:14, and he says that it means that God is pure being. Now, we have a very different approach. We have the Hebraic approach. Right? And we see this, for example, when St. Basil responds to the Plotinian argument that the one, or the monad, right, the beginning point, we'll say, the one, the monad, right? How do you think the Greek philosophers will refer to the one? In the Plotinian system, it's an it. You see the pattern that we're noticing here? God is not an it. So we don't believe that. Let's cross that out. Now, is the problem using the term God exists, God has being, God is logos, God is the one, God is the monad? Is that the problem? No. It's not a terminological problem, because we don't want to fall into the word concept fallacy, which is, the assumption that the same word in different contexts always has the same meaning. It doesn't. What we want to point out, and this is why our whole worldview is unique, is that the I am is a statement of personhood. I is personal. He, I, he. And St. Gregory Palamos actually says this in the chapter of the triads on the essence energy distinction. Towards the end, he says, God did not say in Exodus 3:14, I am an it, I am a thing. He said, I am he. He says, I am, but I am is a statement of personhood. I presupposes he, i.e. hypostasis, a personal being, personal God. The Logos is he. And when St. Basil responded to the Plotinian point about the monad, the one, you got it, is he. Person, right? I am he, the Logos is he, the one is he. Meaning their personhood, nature, person, distinction. So let me erase this real quick. And I want to make this a little clearer in my illustration so that we have a very clear contrast between these two perspectives. And again, this is relevant because, a lot of people are saying, why do you disagree with E. Michael Jones? Why do you disagree with all these Thomas? Why do you disagree on these points? How can I sketch this out? Okay. So I'll put over here Orthodox, and then I'll put Greek/Roman Catholic. Hellenic Greek Roman Catholic. Right. The one, or the monad, is he. This is the point Basil makes to the Plotinians. All right, the one is an it. When we come to the term logos, right? All right. So I am. Okay. Here's the best way I could think of to distinguish the two views. And I understand that Roman Catholics will confess that God is personal, right? So that's not the argument. The argument is not, is there a statement somewhere else in Roman Catholic theology that's true? The argument is on this issue, we see a pattern of difference. For the Orthodox, when we talk about the one, or the monad, the beginning point and principle of our theology, it's personal. It's the personal God, the Father, in Exodus 3:14, not an abstract force or principle. For the Hellenic type of view, which is the problem with the Roman Catholic view is that it's a tension between both Hellenism and Orthodoxy. It has both. That's the problem here, is that it's a mix of those things. So in the Roman Catholic Hellenic view, the one, when they try to appropriate, people like Plotinus or Aristotle, the problem is that in that system, it's an it, right? So the terms, there's not a terminological equivalence from philosopher to theology. That's a root of this issue here. When we look at Orthodox theology and we talk about logos, we're saying it's a he, right? John 1 is not an argument that all the pagan philosophers believe in the Orthodox doctrine of the Logos. It's a statement that the Logos that they're talking about is actually the second person of the Godhead. He's a person. It's not an abstract force. In this other scheme, the Logos is an abstracted force like a number or geometry or something. The term I am from Exodus 3:14, for us it's personal. In this scheme, it's pure being. Right. Now, do we have a problem saying that there is a sense in which God is pure being in the highest sense? Not if you mean that that's an energy, right? I mean, being, existence, does God exist? Absolutely. But that's not a definition of his essence, and we don't equate God's existence with his essence or with his personhood, because that would be to confuse nature and person. So I presupposes he, or is equivalent to he, right? I am he is essentially the way we read Exodus 3:14. So with that in mind, we can start to see how it's possible that St. Maximus in chapter 1 here is not saying that, well, we're conceiving of natural theology in the exact same sense as the Roman Catholic when we utilize terms like pure being or God as the first cause or whatever. There's no problem in saying those things. So let's move on to the next one. He says, God is not in himself, in as much as is possible for us to know, a first principle. God is not a first principle. He's not merely some first cause. He's not an intermediate state. He's not the telos of a thing, the end of a thing, nor any of the other concepts that are found in nature in what is after him. He is indefinite, immobile, infinite, infinitely beyond substance, potentiality, and actuality. Did you hear that? He is infinitely beyond substance, potentiality, and actuality. So here we have a clear statement that it's not the Aristotelian notion. And the Aristotelian categories, although they may be useful, are not ultimately useful for describing God. This is actually a quote from, well, I'll read you the notes here that let's see, I don't know who the scholar is who translated this, but if you get, this is the Saint Vladimir's work, but whoever did the footnotes says, substance or ousia, potentiality, dunamis, and actuality, energeia, are famous from the Aristotelian paradigm. This is a threefold metaphysical division of nature elucidated in Book 9 of Aristotle's Metaphysics and traditionally corresponds with first principle, beginning, arche, origin, intermediate state, and then end being telos. Although Maximus will play with their relationship in significant ways, particularly throughout this work, this later work, many years after the composition of the present treatise, shows us the way he's saying that this shows us the way Maximus uses Aristotle, right? And it's the proper way. So the beginning of the work is to distinguish the categories and terms in the way Aristotle uses them from our theology. So right away, within 2 paragraphs, we have the rejection of the Aristotelian categories in a synonymous definitional sense. There's nothing wrong with the words. Let me give you an example to prove this really easily. Let's say I say there's one God. All right. I'll make this real easy. There's one God. Okay, and you say, I agree with you, there is one God. All right? One God. Right? Now, this phrase itself is fine, isn't it? As far as it goes. But what if I mean by this Satan? Right? There's one God. Oh, but by the way, it's Satan. Now, are you going to be able to have a dialogue with me just on the basis of terminological equivalence because of similar terms? No, of course not. Because what I mean by one God is completely different from what you mean by one God. You see. Right. Now, we know that that's commonsensical. That's like, well, you see that and you're like, well, yeah, that's obvious. Who would disagree with that? Well, this is precisely the root of a giant hundreds of years of confusion over this. Because people mistake terminology for equivalent meaning. The little g God of Aristotle is thought thinking itself. That's not God. So when Aristotle says there's a first cause, that's true as far as it goes. But when you unpack it, we see that it doesn't match up to who God is. That's the issue. And it really is that simple. And that's why once we really start to look at examples of how Aristotle is used, we see that it's not the same. It's not the way the Thomistic natural theology scheme utilizes it. And that's why natural theology, of course, is very, there's no doubting that that's the Roman Catholic dogma, right? There's natural theology. It's all the way up into Vatican I. He goes on to say, each substance, including its own definition of itself, is a first principle by nature of the productive movement discerned in potentiality. Each natural motion towards activity, conceptualized after substance, yet prior to actuality, is an intermediate state. So he's just talking about the different states of being and things, right? But notice that he had pointed out that God is not a first principle. Then he talks about being objects in the world coming from, moving from potentiality to actuality. And he says that each being in the world is circumscribed by its particular Logoi towards the end of its movement, and is the end of substantializing movement conceptually prior to it. So here is where we begin to have him talking about the doctrine of the Logoi. And the terms that Maximus uses here are not just the similarity to the causes of Aristotle, right? Aristotle's causes, material, efficient, formal, final, etc. Material, formal, efficient, final. The Logoi are patterns, archetypes, principles, exemplars, if we want to use the Western term, thought wills, predeterminations of all created beings. Thus, they have a created and an uncreated aspect to them. Now, it's actually in Ambiguum 7, which is where Maximus really fleshes this part out. Now, if you're getting a little confused, don't worry. It's not that big of a deal. We're going to try to make it simple here. Now, you can, if you want the abridged treatment, if you have this book, right, on page 45, it gets into the basics of the Logoi doctrine in Ambiguum 7. But this Ambiguum is a bit abridged, if I recall. It's been many years since I read this version, because I ended up getting the full 2-volume set of the Ambiguum, right? And unless I'm wrong and that's not abridged, there's a lot more going on when we go back and read the full Ambiguum here in 7, because I don't remember this one talking about Origen's doctrine of stasis, and that's where Ambiguum 7 here begins. So actually, this is significantly more pages, so let me actually just check that real quick to make sure that I'm not misinforming you. I don't want to misinform you on this. So in this book, Ambiguum 7 is 75 to page 1. So it's about 40 pages in this book. And then over here, Ambiguum 7 is 30 pages. But it could be the font. Yeah, anyway, I don't know. Maybe it's fully the same. But I would rather have this because it's the entire work. This is just selections, right? Selections of Maximus, but it may be the full Ambiguum 7, I'm not positive. But this is the full 2 volumes of the Ambiguum itself. Much more expansive, a lot more going on in that work. So here's the terminology that we have from Maximus that will be used about what Logoi are. They're the patterns of things. They're the archetypes of things. They're the principles of things. In the West, if you read Torstein Tollefson's book on the Logoi. He'll talk about how it is the same as the Western idea of the exemplars. They're spoken of as thought wills. They're spoken of as predeterminations. And they are all of those things of created beings. And he will go on to explain, and Father Florovsky has a great essay, by the way, on this, resolving some of the difficulties in this doctrine, which is a very difficult doctrine to understand. And they have a created and an uncreated aspect to them. But the reason this is so key is that, remember, in St. Gregory Palamas's book, that a lot of the Roman Catholics have been fussing over this, there's a section where Palamas says that the energies of God are infinite. But what they haven't really paid attention to is that that's citing St. Maximus in the works that I'm talking about here. And in fact, I just wrote the essay about grace being, is grace created or uncreated? I actually cite the ambiguum. I put pictures of the actual pages up because I knew people wouldn't believe. They would say I was lying about the quotes or misquoting or something. So I would just put literal pictures of the entire page up. So this is what we know that the Logoi are. They're patterns, archetypes, principles, exemplars, thought wills, predeterminations of all created beings, and they have a created and an uncreated aspect to them. Why do we say that? Well, let's take you for an example, or me. Doesn't matter, right? Any created thing, every molecule. What we're saying here is that all of these principles, these are essentially different ways of speaking about the same thing, right? And it's what Maximus is talking about here about with the Aristotelian categories applied to a being. Actually, let's not use a human. Let's use something easier, like what's Aristotle's? An acorn, right? The acorn progresses into the tree, and it becomes the telos of the acorn is to become the tree. So you have in the process of the lifespan, you could say, of the acorn, it goes into the ground, it gestates, germinates, whatever, it pops out, it gets watered. There's movement and activity that's proper to acorns and seeds to grow into the tree. It has its vegetative activity and growth and energy and all that. So that whole process, essentially, Maximus is here applying to the Logoi, the logic of that being. So we could say in a way that it's the logic and the meanings of things. And he even uses the term universals and particulars, right? They also come into play with describing the Logoi. So what we're saying here is that actual tree, that actual acorn, from all eternity, had its pattern, principle, archetype, predetermination, its existence, the process of its growth and coming to its telos, its purpose. All of that is part of its Logoi in the mind of God. You see. Now, at this point, we might be tempted to say, okay, well, but how is that really different from the Roman Catholic view? Because the Roman Catholics, all the way back to Augustine and utilizing Platonic arguments, this is Plato's forms, right? I mean, this is Plato putting the forms of things, the essences of things, that they're in this monad, right? They're in the essence of God. And so what the world is this kind of emanation, this reflection that kind of pours forth from the one, from the monad, from God, we'll say, if you're a Platonist or a Roman Catholic perhaps. And that's what creation is a reflection of all of these different many forms from the essence of God. And so what we have, for example, in the Roman Catholic doctrine is that the archetypes, the forms, the exemplars of all created things are identical to the essence of God. That's literally the Western view. This is why we have to be careful, and this is why for the East, these many works of God that have both a created and uncreated aspect to them are uncreated energies. They're not the essence of God. So let's take that acorn. Remember that acorn? And that it becomes the tree, right? So we're going to say that the whole lifespan and the whole meaning from all eternity of that tree, that tree, is from the mind of God. Yes, right? Now, did God have to create that tree? No, right? God possesses free will. Creation is a free action of God, as pretty much everybody at least confesses. Nobody except the Platonist believes that God had to create. So that's why the term of the Eastern Fathers was modified. That's why they said thought will. Because even though these are uncreated works of God, God doesn't have to create them. God can have an infinite variety of logoi, of patterns and principles and things, and yet not necessarily have to create them. Why is that? Because he's free. Because he doesn't have to bring into actuality everything that's in potentiality. Hence, Aristotle, East and West by Bradshaw. That's one of the key arguments of that book. And in the same way, the patterns of created things do not have to come to be in time and space and history, unless God wills them to be. So that's how we preserve the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, being a free creation by God's free will. Right? Ex nihilo by God's free will is because God doesn't have to bring these logoi into actuality, into existence. But some of them he does. And when he does, when they come to be and when they have their lifespan and their fruition and so forth, that is on the basis of their logoi, all of which are one in the Logos. So the one and the many issue is not just solved in the sense of the triad, it's also solved in the question of the Logos and the Logoi. So these many, many, many predeterminations, patterns, archetypes, principles, thought wills, they're also all one in who? The Logos. Is the Logos an abstract force? No, he's Jesus. This is what we say Paul means when Paul talks about in Colossians that all things in him live and move, have their being, subsist in him. Acts 17, we all live and move in him. This is what we think Paul's talking about, this doctrine. Paul teaches the Logoi doctrine in Colossians and in Acts 17. Now, if this is the case, and we think that it is, then this is another reason why there's not natural theology. Because the meanings of things in nature are Jesus. The Logos is the meaning of all things that exist. And we don't put a dialectic between the one and the many. God both allows for diversity and for unity. And he himself, as Dionysius all the way to Palamos says, transcends those distinctions. Because he's the ineffable one, the superessential one, as Dionysius says in the Divine Names. So when we understand this, when we understand that, by the way, the Dionysius in the Divine Names also teaches the doctrine of the Logoi, and if you don't recall that, go back and listen again to the Dionysius talk. Then we understand that this is how we keep a balance in our system. And this is what Maximus is telling us. Now, this is very fascinating because if we think about the way Paul speaks in the first few chapters of Colossians on this issue of the Logoi, when he talks about it, then what we understand is the doctrine of recapitulation. This is why recapitulation is so unique to Orthodox theology and so distinct from Latin and Western theology. So what we're getting at here is that the Logoi doctrine immediately teaches us the doctrine of recapitulation. So we're going to see that in Colossians 1, 2, and 3. Acts 17, in him we live and move and have our being. John 1 with the Logos doctrine. I just went blank. I had a great Oh, Romans 8. That's it. The other important recapitulation text. So if we go back to Irenaeus and we think about the way Irenaeus talks about Christ recapitulating everything that Adam lost, we think about 1 Corinthians 15. Christ as the second Adam, recapitulating everything that Adam lost. Then we understand that the Logoi doctrine is not some abstract Platonic thing that we're somehow setting out off on its own. We're actually talking about incarnation and redemption. So the recapitulation doctrine, of course, is that Christ's incarnation doesn't just affect human nature, it also affects all of creation underneath human nature, right? Because Adam was created to be the steward of God's world, and that applies to all reality, and that's why when Adam sinned, it affected the whole created order, right? The whole created order, as Romans 8 says, was put into under the bondage of corruption. And so when we have the incarnation, we believe that the created order that was kind of jarred and knocked off of its foundation, Christ in the incarnation is recapitulating and restoring in a cosmic scope the mistake of Adam, you see. So it's not just Colossians and these, it's the totality of the doctrine of the incarnation that becomes different from East and West. And that's why Maximus is such a pivotal, distinctive figure for us. And he teaches recapitulation very clearly. He teaches the recapitulation doctrine as a result of the Logoi, you see. Again, now this does not mean that everybody's saved. That's a different discussion. We don't say that. But what we are saying is that there is a cosmic dimension to redemption that was lost in the West because of this, you see. That's why this is so different. This is another aspect and reason why we can't really do natural theology, because let me give you one easy example, as I've pointed out in multiple talks. When we look out of the natural world, we see that death is operant in this world. And if we were to just reason up from the world that we experience, empirically see and experience out there now, to try to figure out who God is, we would come to the conclusion that, well, God's kind of a psychopathic creator and a bumbling old man, because he seems to create a world where death and life are equally necessary, right? When we look out in nature, we see death and predatory prey, right? Death seems to permeate all of the created order, and it's just as necessary and just as cyclical as life, right? One man dies and another generation is born, right? Living organisms feed on decaying corpses, etc. Predators prey. And as many of these atheists have actually legitimately pointed out, if I were to just use natural theology, then I would conclude that the God of this world, apart from revelation, is some kind of Gnostic demiurge or psychopath. But why would we reject that argument? We would reject that argument because we say, wait a minute, Mr. Atheist. You're forgetting that the way that we interpret the world out there from our paradigm as Orthodox is because of the doctrine of creation and the doctrine of the fall. I can't properly interpret the world out there without a doctrine of the fall. But the doctrine of the fall is not something I can derive from staring at plants and trees and rocks all day. The doctrine of the fall comes to me on the basis of revealed theology in Scripture, you see. So now what we're starting to understand is that the proper interpretation of the world out there requires revelation. Exactly. So, for example, if I were to consider what exists out there. When I talk about existence, this is another great example that I brought up in one of the other talks, right? Let's take the term existence. For me, existence is created by God. All things that exist, right? For the atheist, for example, existence just is. You could perhaps say, well, matter's just always been there, or at least as far as we know from the Big Bang, right? So for him, it's not created. So even something generic like a term like existence, we would think it would have the same meanings across paradigms. But it doesn't. Because for me, everything that exists is created by God and has its meaning, its Logoi in God. For the atheist, for example, everything that exists is not created. It does not have its meaning in God. It just is. And it doesn't matter whatever different Big Bang or whatever they want to use, or the world was always here, it's eternal, or it was a Big Bang. It doesn't matter because it's not created, you see. So even a term like existence is not going to mean the same thing to me and my paradigm and my presuppositions as it will to an atheist. So again, what we're realizing here is that the Thomistic conception of natural theology, where we just kind of look out at nature and we see causes and effect, and we kind of just reason back through a series of chains that there had to be at some point in the distant past some unmoved mover to set all this in motion. What a terrible argument. Because the proper interpretation of the world is not an unmoved mover setting things in motion. It's a personal God creating ex nihilo, and then a doctrine of the fall that explains that world. And if you don't have that, which is revealed theology, you can't properly interpret the world. But to appeal to that violates the Thomistic scheme of natural theology. So Maximus goes on to say, God is not a substance, he is not a quality or an unqualified or qualified substance, and therefore he is not a first principle. So much for the unmoved mover argument. Now, is God an unmoved mover? Yeah. But those terms, those ideas, they mean different things in different systems. God is not a potentiality or an intermediate state or actuality. He's kind of restating what he had just said. He's not a quality. The first principle, the intermediate state, etc. He's kind of restating again what he was talking about with the Logoi. When he says that when things come to be, in section paragraph 1.5, he says, the first principle, the intermediate state, and the end of things are identifying marks that are divided by time for objects. Right? So one could ask, speaking of things truly, even of things that are seen as a unity in eternity, speaking of the Logoi, for time, which is measured in motion, is circumscribed by number, whereas eternity, possessing the category of when, is conceptualized together with, he's just contrasting time and eternity as well. With its existence, it undergoes distension, since it presupposes a first principle of being. And if time and eternity are not without a first principle, all the more things that are contained within them. So he's actually giving a presuppositional argument. Now, moving on here, he says that God is, in the proper sense, always by nature one and simple. He always encompasses in himself in every way the totality of what is being in the proper sense. Exactly what we've been saying. Since he indeed is the proper sense beyond being itself. That's from Dionysius. And so, if in no way, anywhere does anything belong to him. If so, in no way, anywhere does anything of which being is predicated have being in the proper sense. Saying God's being is not the same as created being. Consequently, nothing at all different in substance can be simultaneously contemplated with him coevally. In other words, there's no eternal creation that's together with him, nor an eternity, nor a time, nor any of those living things within these. So in other words, creation is not eternal. For what being is in the proper sense and what it is not, and what is not being in the proper sense, do not ever coincide with each other. No first principle, no intermediate state and end is absolutely precluded from every relational category. God, however, incomprehensibly being infinitely above absolutely every relation, is evidently neither a first principle, nor an intermediate state, nor an end, nor altogether anything else of those things which are the categories of towards something that can be envisioned amongst the categories of relations. All beings possess the identifying first principles that demonstrate what is known about them and are called intelligible. God, however, is not termed intelligible, but is only believed to be on the basis of intelligible things. Therefore, none of the intelligible things in any way is to be compared with him. So God is not equated to any of the conceptions or any of the intelligible realities or categories that we come up with, right, because of apophatic theology. What is known of beings naturally includes the interwoven intrinsic Logoi as to what make it demonstrable, by which it naturally admits circumscription. But God is only believed to be through the Logoi in beings, since it is more certain than any demonstration, and giving to it the pious assent and faith that he is in the proper sense. He is in the proper sense. For faith is true knowledge, having indemonstrable first principles. Exactly. In other words, they're not demonstrable because they're circular. They're presuppositions. That doesn't mean that they're not true. It means that they're indemonstrable in the way that normative demonstration happens, because God is the precondition of all conditions. God is the first principle, the intermediate state, and the end of all beings. But insofar as he is active but not passive, just as all other terms of which he is named among us, so he is the first principle as creator, intermediate state as providential provider, and end as subscription. From him, through him, and to him are all things. So how can he say that God is not identified with it, and also that he is the beginning, middle, and the end? It's because of apophatic theology, because there's a distinction between what God is naturally in himself and the actions, the energies that he has towards creation. That's how. Now, more of this can be fleshed out in Ambiguum 7, but we've gone for an hour, and I just wanted to illustrate that what we've seen here, and again, there's a lot more in the Ambiguum, especially in Ambiguum 7 on the Logoi, where we could get into depth concerning Genesis, kinesis, and then stasis in the Origenist position in relationship to the beatific vision. And that's actually what this great chapter, Ambiguum 7, shows us, is that it's not only a critique of absolute divine simplicity and the presuppositions of Origenism, it's also a critique of the beatific vision by extension, because the beatific vision is essentially borrowed from the Origenist type position, which is a Platonic type position, that when you reach the eternal state, it's about being immobile, because because the intellect is supposedly completely satiated. Now, many fathers do teach that there is a sense of seeing God in a special way in all eternity. Say Maximus in the Paulus Press version, there's a section where Maximus talks about the vision of God, but he says that we see all things in God through the Logoi, exactly what we just read in the 200 chapters on theology. We see all things in the Logoi because they are uncreated energies, and we participate in those uncreated energies. And if you read the essay, Created and Uncreated Grace, just if you may not want to read the whole essay, just read those 3 pages that I screenshotted from the Ambiguum, and you'll see that he's saying all the things that I'm saying. In fact, he's abundantly clear about the uncreated energies in those passages. I'll leave a link to that below, as well as the old talk, which this can kind of function as an additional talk relevant to the Aeneids, to Fount of Knowledge that we did 3 years ago, to Aristotle, and now part 2 of Barlaamite and Maximus. So I hope you enjoy the introduction to the Logoi, to Maximus. I'm sure in the near future we'll have many, many more discussions on this topic, especially since Ambiguum 7 is so loaded. Thank you.